Do we have the original manuscripts of New Testament? Let's hear from Professor Bart Erhman. Bart Erhman is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina, at Chapel Hill. Professor Erhman completed his Master's of Divinity and Ph.D. degrees at Princeton Seminary. He is an expert on the New Testament and the history of early Christianity. 5 of his books have been on the New York Times bestseller list. His books have been translated into 27 languages.
The problem is not the number of manuscripts or the fact that we have more than for any other author of antiquity. The problem is the ages of these manuscripts. How many manuscripts of the New Testament do we have from the first Christian century? None. From the decades after the books were written, how many do we have? The years afterwards, the decade, none. 0. How many do we have from the early 2nd century? Say, manuscripts that clearly date up to around the year 150. We have 1 scrap. This is it. This may look big because it's a big screen. This is the actual size. It's the size of a credit card. It's written on both front and back. It's from John chapter 18. It has several verses on it. You can see this little scrap has parts of 7 lines on it. It's a very important manuscript because it's the earliest one we have. It's the early 2nd century, and it is the only manuscript we have from the early 2nd century. That's it. How many complete manuscripts do we have from the 2nd and 3rd centuries? We're not just talking about decades now after these things were originally written and copied and mistakes made and mistakes replicated and then more mistakes made and more replicated. We're not talking about years or decades. We're talking about centuries. How many complete manuscripts do we have from the 2nd and 3rd centuries? None. 0. Well, if we have 5,500 manuscripts, where are they from? When are they from? Well, 94% of our surviving manuscripts come from the 9th century and later. 94% come from the 9th century, which is great if you want to know what the Bible looked like when Christians were reading it in the year 890. But if you want to know how they were reading it in the year 70, you've got a problem, because you don't have manuscripts from that period. If you wanted to make a stack of the Bibles that are available to scholars today in manuscript form, the stack would go up to the ceiling. If you want to make a stack of the manuscripts that were made within, say, 60 or 80 years of the production of these books, you wouldn't be able to see the stack if we put it on the stage, because there's hardly anything. We do not have the originals of the New Testament, period. In order to understand what I mean by that, we have to realize how books were made in the ancient world. In the ancient world, when the Bible was produced, books could not be mass-produced. This was before electronic publication. Kinkos were the printing press. Books were written by hand, and they were copied by hand. If you wanted a copy of a book, somebody had to copy it for you, or you had to copy it yourself. You copied it 1 page, 1 sentence, 1 word at a time. What happens when somebody sits down to try to copy a book by hand? Invariably what happens is they make mistakes, either on purpose or accidentally. Scribes who copied texts in the ancient world changed their texts. Let me explain how it worked by giving an example from the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark. We're not sure who Mark was, when he lived, where he lived. Whoever he was, he wrote a gospel. If anybody wanted a copy of this Gospel of Mark, they had to make a copy by hand, and so they did so. But invariably, they made a mistake or 2 or 3 or 20. When someone came along who wanted a copy of that copy, they copied the copy and they replicated the mistakes that the first copyist made. And they made their own mistakes. And then when a third person came along to copy the copy of the copy, they replicated the mistakes of both of their predecessors and made mistakes of their own. And it went on like this week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The only time mistakes got corrected in the process was when somebody was copying something and realized that there was a mistake and thought that his predecessor had made a mistake and so tried to correct the mistake. The problem is there's no telling whether a person who corrected the mistake corrected it correctly. It's possible that he corrected the mistake incorrectly, in which case you have three forms of the text: the original text, the text that was changed, and the incorrect correction of the change. Things like that go on for a very long time. We don't have the original copy that Mark made. We don't have the first copy. We don't have copies of the copy. We don't have copies of the 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 copies. The earliest copy that we have of Mark dates from around the year 200, probably about 130 years after the original. That's the first copy that we have, 130 years after the original. We don't have the originals of Mark or of any other book of the New Testament. If God preserved the original text intact, where is it? Why don't we have it, and why doesn't He know where it is? I don't know the answer to that.
If the question means, are the original New Testament documents lost, then yes, of course they are. Only quacks and charlatans, people who got their diplomas from a Cracker Jack box, would argue otherwise.
Even the Christian apologists are admitting that they don't have the original manuscript of New Testament. Were the original Bible books preserved by reciting in prayers 5 times every day, openly in populace? No. Is it possible that the original Bible books were preserved by memorization from generations to generations? No. Were the original Bible books written down and preserved by well-recognized eyewitnesses? No. Conclusion. Original manuscripts of New Testament are totally lost. The earliest complete New Testament manuscripts are from 9th century, meaning about 1,000 years after Jesus, which also have many contradictory versions. A question for every Christian who are honest, knowledgeable, and not close-minded or obstinate. Is New Testament trustworthy? An honest person will never respond to this question yes. The honest answer to this question is no.
Like, share, and subscribe to create awareness. We are also available on Facebook, Google+, Twitter, and Paltalk.
Untuk mendukung dakwah ini, jangan lupa like, subscribe, dan tekan tombol notifikasi. Semoga Allah Azza wa Jalla membalas kebaikan kalian, menetapkan hati kita di atas Islam, dan menyelamatkan kita dari panas api neraka.